Funny story about that, Francis. So many years ago, at the church I was serving, I talked to the staff one August, September about maybe doing a blessing of the animals. Nobody was doing it very much then, and I wanted to try it, and they all agreed that that would be a good idea. We had quite a conversation about it. Would it be inside? Would it be outside? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And the very next morning when we came to church, that little statue was outside the front door. And we never knew where it came from or who put it there, or when I left that church many years later, nobody had fessed up. So we kind of took that as a sign that we were on the right track. So for 22 years of ministry, I held a blessing of the animals on the Sunday nearest October 4th, the feast of St. Francis. When I retired 2 years ago, it wasn't the Advent or Christmas or Easter services I missed the most. It was St. Francis Sunday. Blessing pets and their guardians, both young and old, was pure joy. So I asked Pastor Hector and David if they would indulge me today so I could scratch my St. Francis itch. Note that I did not even broach a subject of doing a blessing of animals. I thought that was just a little too much for a part-time interim associate pastor to ask for. And as we begin this month with a focus on stewardship, I think Francis actually has something to say to that. So first, a little biography about Francis. He was born in 1181 into a wealthy merchant class family. This was the late Middle Ages, where money and wealth were changing the economy. Merchants were upper class and the poor were very poor. As a young man, Francis was what we would probably call a spoiled brat. He took for granted everything that he had, and he lived an undisciplined, carefree, playful life. He gave away his father's money and his merchant goods. He was a ringleader and always the life of the party. And he wanted to be a hero, a real knight in shining armor. So lucky for him, war broke out between Assisi and a neighboring town, and off he went to battle, hoping to come back a hero. But he came home a wounded prisoner of war, emaciated and sick with malaria. If Francis would have taken over the family business, he would have been assured a life of wealth and privilege and power, but he returned from war despondent and aimless. He wandered around Assisi, searching for meaning and purpose. One day he found himself in a small rundown chapel called San Damiano. As he rested and prayed, he heard a voice say, "Francis, rebuild my church." He understood it literally and set about restoring the little church. This was an important turning point in his life because it gave him a focus and an interest that was not self-centered and was for the good of others. But of course, in order to finance the restoration, he took his father's money and goods and his horse without permission and sold them all to pay for the repairs. To make a long story a little bit shorter, Francis's father demanded that he repay all he had stolen, but of course Francis no longer had the money. So the bishop of Assisi held court in town square with Francis and his father Peter and townspeople looking on. The bishop told Francis to return the money and all would be forgiven. Francis stripped off his clothes and gave them to the bishop. Standing there naked, he said, "From now on, I want only to say, 'Our Father in heaven,' and not my father, Peter Bernardone." And that was the end of Francis's relationship with his father and the beginning of his life of poverty. So that's the backstory of Francis of Assisi. He grew up in wealth and privilege. Disillusioned, he took on a tunic of simplicity and an ethic of poverty and immersed himself in following the way of Christ. Over time, Francis came to understand that the voice that spoke to him at San Damiano directed him to rebuild the church, the big C church, not the little c churches that he had been working to restore. People tolerated this itinerant ascetic who begged for food and a place to sleep, who owned nothing, not even sandals for his feet. He began to care for lepers who were banished from town and sent to communities to languish in their disease. He combined a contemplative life with a life of service to others. There was a biblical practice when one was searching for guidance. It went like this: open the Bible randomly 3 times and follow the instructions of whatever you find in those passages. Kind of a risky thing to do in my estimation. You could end up in one of those Old Testament books that talks about war and all of that. But nonetheless, he came upon these passages. Go, sell what you own, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me. Take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, nor money, not even an extra tunic. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves. These became the guiding principles of his life. Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. This is attributed to Francis. We don't know if he really said it. But he wasn't interested in joining an organized monastic order. He wasn't a trained theologian. He was more of a street corner preacher living a life of compassion and simplicity and charity to convey the mystery of the cross and the deep, enduring love of God to all creation. So you were wondering, what about the animals? Where do they come into the story of Francis? Well, here's one story that's been recorded about this. Francis was annoyed at the indifference so many people were taking to his message of peace and nonviolence. He said that he would probably have a more respectful hearing from the birds. So here the story goes. There was a great multitude of birds of different types gathered. When Francis saw them, he ran toward them, leaving his companions on the road, and he greeted them in his usual way. The Lord give you peace. My brother birds, you should greatly praise your Creator and love him always. He gave you feathers to wear, wings to fly, and whatever you need. God made you noble among his creatures and gave you a home so that though you neither sow nor reap, he nevertheless protects you without your least care. The birds stretched their necks, spread their wings, opened their beaks, and looked at him. Then he blessed them and gave them permission to fly off to another place. And from that day on, he carefully exhorted all birds, all animals, all reptiles to praise and love the Creator. Another encounter was recorded this way. Francis was about to preach to a crowd, but a large number of swallows nesting were shrieking and chirping, so people couldn't hear him. So he said to the noisy birds, "My sister swallows, now it is time for me to speak, since you have already said enough. Listen to the word of the Lord and stay quiet and calm." And immediately the birds fell silent to the amazement and surprise of all present, and they did not move from that place until the sermon was over. Wild beasts would flee to him. A village was saved from being tormented by a deadly wolf. The accounts of Francis's life are filled with these stories. For Francis, it was not only about honoring the good creation that came from God, but that seeking peace with all creation was a way to recapture Eden, the place before the fall when God and humankind and all creatures lived in peace and harmony. His song of praise for Brother Sun and Sister Moon, the Canticle of the Sun, in our hymnals as all creatures worship God Most High, came from this deep connection with creation. Compassion, simplicity, charity. the hallmarks of Franciscan life. Although he practiced unfailing compassion towards others, Francis lived a life of personal sacrifice. He was often sick with malaria and other ailments due to inadequate nutrition, contaminated water, poor hygiene. His eyes were diseased, leading him to be blind. Even when sick, he would get up from his bed to beg for food for others who were sick, and he would give away medicines that were given to him. In his waning days, he composed beautiful poems that we treasure yet today. I'm sure you're familiar with the prayer of St. Francis, the one that begins, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." There's one other significant accomplishment that bears sharing. At the age of 38, Francis signed up for the Fifth Crusade. They were coming one after the other. The purpose of this one was to convert the Muslims in Egypt to Christianity. Tremendous blood was shed on both sides in the names of God and Allah. The war had reached a stalemate, so Francis crossed the battle lines and made his way to meet with the Sultan of Egypt, intent on converting him and then ending the war. What Francis found, however, was a man of deep faith woven into his life in much the same way that Christ was woven into his life. Neither converted the other, but they developed a mutual respect and admiration for the other, proving that getting to know one another is more powerful than swords, and respect for one another is a pathway to peace and understanding. Now, a word about stewardship. Francis's life is a testament about stewardship of resources and how one can be influenced by or responsive to the extremes of abundance and wealth and simplicity and poverty. Francis struggled to find meaning in his life until that moment at San Damiano when he discovered a purpose that was focused outside of himself and toward helping others. For him, a life of poverty and the reliance on the benevolence of others became his orientation toward the stewardship of resources. Stewardship is not just about money. Well, it is about money, of course, but not only that. So I challenge you to think today about stewardship as an orientation of your life and decision-making about the resources that have been entrusted to you. We, as human beings on this planet Earth, have been given the responsibility to be stewards of many things, of ourselves and the gifts and talents God has provided us, of our resources, both personal and communal, of things that do not belong to us but are entrusted to us, our precious planet, its air and water, its climate, our neighbors, our faith, our community, our church and its mission, and our baptismal calling to be the presence of Christ in the world. Francis's life began with disrespect for the stewardship of his privilege and his familial position of power and wealth. Through his orientation toward the way of Christ, he began to encounter the divine in the lepers that he cared for, the birds and the forest, for people like the Sultan who encounter the divine in different ways. Pastor Hector has mentioned Richard Rohr, a Franciscan teacher and mentor, many times. As a Franciscan, he challenges us to see and appreciate the divine in all things. One time I heard him say, "Consider it as the presence, just stare at a blade of grass for a very long time, and consider it as the presence of the divine right there in front of you, under your feet, between your toes." This is stewardship, an orientation toward the divine in all things. As we journey through these next weeks, I invite you to reflect on stewardship as an orientation of your life. like Francis, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. Amen.